Okay, so we're today at number two, part two of the workshop process on economics at the end of a delusion by Lyndon LaRouche, 2002 masterpiece in my regard. Pascal has read this some years back, so have I, and yeah, this was just what we decided would be the best thing to follow up on the work on Hamilton that we had read over the course of 4 or 5 weeks. So last week, with the first introduction, just to be quick, we were introduced very quickly to the essence of LaRouche's approach to physical economic forecasting. How was it that in the 1970s he was able to make relatively strong forecasts of economic collapses that were missed by pretty much every other professional economist at play? And, LaRouche basically gets across, he doesn't read tea leaves. He was just simply looking at those processes that most directly impact human life, and not just human life now, but also the potential to sustain human life into the future, and whether the sets of ideas that we're applying to shape the economic models and the behavior of what we define as being profit or whatever, are they in conformity to activities in the real world that improve the productive powers and the scientific powers that leap beyond the limits to growth? If we do that, we know we're generally going to be on the right track. Well, it'll never be perfect because it could always be better, but it's going to be on the right trajectory. And when you stop doing that and you start just focusing myopically on monetary considerations, as we saw in the case of the absurd response to the unpayable debts of Weimar Germany, which just saw the printing presses go into infinite printing, or in the case of the austerity that made an already bad Great Depression even worse and more depressed in the 1932 period, it doesn't do well. You basically drive yourself ever more into the grave. So at a time like that, which is not all that different, and LaRouche drew a lot of parallels of these experiences and what people like Franklin Roosevelt did to pull us out of that negative trajectory towards a new trajectory that had a future built into the potentials. There's a lot of parallels to our present crisis-ridden age. So that was something, and again, this is a paper from 2002, 20 years ago, where he's outlining exactly the essence of why we are destined to face the collapse we are currently facing unless remedial action is not taken that is of a systemic character. So we began reading the chapter that introduces a little bit more the essence of economics, where I believe the last reading we went through the quality of the general welfare as being the principle that gave meaning to anything good that came out of the period of the golden renaissance that sparked from Florence, but all around Europe, which saw a massive explosion in population, both in quantity, but also in quality of life, longevity, reduction of infant mortality. But more importantly, culturally, we had the explosion of discoveries in every single field that were revolutionized: architecture, science. Look at the quality of expression in painting, in music. It was just bam. It's like nothing didn't have a touch of the divine, despite the fact that there were efforts by an oligarchical class to put that baby back in the cradle, to try to crush it before it could really be fulfilled in its birth. Hence Renaissance, right? The very idea just means rebirth. So that was something that was a very important set of principles, that out of which came the queen of all sciences, as LaRouche gets across, that was advanced, especially out of the American Revolution. We got a taste of that with Hamilton, with writings by Lincoln and Henry C. Carey the previous weeks in our reading group. But the idea was always that whether you were a king, whether you were Louis XI or Henry VII, or whether you were a Republican, the point being was that your idea of what justified the behavior of your economic practice was, did you see yourself as an instrument of God's will, of the will of the creator, and not just simply a tyrant imposing your will onto the slaves to be obeyed by you just because you're born into the better family or something. To that degree, law was seen also as something which we abide by, but only to the degree that that law is in conformity with natural law, the law that is already there in the fabric of nature. So when we do that and we act that way and we shape our laws that way, economically included, things go well. The universe resonates by giving us certain freedoms that we would not have had we been ignorant or in defiance to those truths. So that's part of the reciprocity between energy policy, right? What is a proper approach to defining what type of energy we wish to use to support our population? Because obviously when you have 8 billion people, there's going to be very different energy requirements than a population that might be only, let's say, 2 billion or 500 million. There's different requirements, right? You can't just use the same type of tech we were using back in the 15th century. So again, principle of the general welfare as a moral principle that is at the heart of a science of economics. That's where I think we touched on that idea. And lastly, we were introduced to the idea of modern fascism, which we'll recapitulate in the reading today. Specifically the role of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel P. Huntington, and the universal fascists that emerged in the wake of the murders of John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and who described themselves, as we discovered, as such. People like Michael Ledeen was brought up, a leading neocon who actually promulgated an idea of universal fascism as somehow being a good thing, which we could now see in its expression in the post-Soviet age, right, which was the age of the New World Order, the end of history of 1992 and beyond, which to this very day, a lot of idiot technocrats are still holding on to, believing they could turn back the clock 30 years into the past, undo the existence of any opposition to their utopic, depopulated world order, and simply go back in time. They can't, but they want to. And it's fascist, even though, again, that word gets, as we were talking before I recorded, bandied about and abused way too much, but that's really, LaRouche is getting at a science of what is fascism in a more universal sense of the word. So with that, I'm going to do a little screen share. Here we are. Okay. Oops. Okay. Can people read the PDF here?
I've got a problem with this. On the right-hand side of my screen are all of the, the participants in the conversation, and on the left-hand side of the screen there is the, the next potential page.
I got so the solution to you, Paul, is you can physically move the screen that has all of the images of the people here, and you could physically move it with your mouse to the part of the screen which doesn't cover up the text. Fine,
yeah, okay, yeah.
You see it?
I've been trying to move the one on the left, trying to get rid of that so I can see the. Okay. Done that. Yeah.
All right, cool. So I figured what we could do, we're not going to go to the beginning of the last section, which was titled "What is Economics?" What we'll do instead, we will jump into this question of modern fascism, which I think as good of any spot to jump into would be, well, he's talking about Samuel P. Huntington, a character who had defined a certain strategy known as the clash of civilizations, the idea that the world order going into the future must be based upon the reality that all the different religious groups and civilizational groups could, because they have different beliefs, could only end in war amongst the civilizations and religions who think differently. And the only chance of any form of peace in Huntington's world, because he's a Hobbesian, is a Leviathan. The strongest would be able to manage the fighting from above. In his case, the chosen Leviathan would be the Anglo-American machine that would manage the rise of radical Islam, and that would fight, the Jews, and they would fight the Confucians, and they would fight the Hindus, and the Hindus would fight the Sikhs, and you just have all of that perpetual chaos managed by the Leviathan. Again, completely absurd. Ignores the fact that so much of history has been defined by cooperation amongst diverse civilizations and cultures without going to war, unless you have arsonists lighting fires and blaming the different parties to fight each other. But besides that, he ignores that. So we could just jump into, as Huntington speaks for today, Who would like to read today?
I can start.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Thanks, Pascal.
All right. Okay. As Huntington speaks for today's often explicitly self-described universal fascists generally, the Huntington-Brzezinski image of the role of the military harks back to the genocidal practices of the Roman legions and the Nazi Waffen-SS. Legions of the professional warrior, recruited from assorted nationalities, as the instrument of death deployed by a global neo-Roman universal fascist tyranny, which hunts, herds, and culls populations, as the Nazi Waffen-SS echoed the Roman legions in this genocidal practice. These universal fascists have appeared in the Anglo-American sphere as chiefly products of the process out of which the British Fabian Society emerged. The most influential such ideologues include Thomas Huxley's Golem, H.G. Wells, whose 1928 The Open Conspiracy typifies the way in which the Fabian method promotes the universal fascist influences expressed by such Wellesian fanatics of the Brzezinski circle as the former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who confessed herself a Wells follower, speaking as Secretary of State openly in a 1999 public address. The influence of Bertrand Russell and his Unification of the Sciences project is an integral part of that same campaign for universal fascism detailed step by step in Wells's The Open Conspiracy. The principal target for destruction chosen by these contemporary universal fascists is always the modern sovereign form of nation-state republic and the doctrine of the general welfare or common good. It is sufficient to study The Open Conspiracy and to note that Bertrand Russell signed on to that policy publicly to understand how the influences of universal fascism work intellectually as they permeate the departments specializing in the so-called social sciences in academic and related life in the United States and its government institutions today. In summary, these universal fascists, with their present frantic search for an integralist pagan ethic, are the modern expression of the attempted resurgence of the model of the ancient Roman and kindred empires and of the worst of medieval Europe's history. The essence of the movement for universal fascism, typified by Brzezinski et al. Within the USA, is a movement whose purpose for existence is to eradicate the existence of the modern nation state from any and all parts of this planet, and to replace the nation state with world government over the population-controlled inhabitants of a global, dehumanized zoo. There is no significant danger to civilization on this planet today, which could not be made manageable were this threat to be removed. To paraphrase a famous Harvard professor, those who do not wish to recognize my emphasis upon history may be forced to relive the very worst part of what they, who presently profess, "I don't go there," prefer to ignore. Therefore, all competent policy assessments of the present world economic situation, that of the USA itself, most notably, are rooted in a grasp of the continuing historical origins of modern society. The following brief summary of the point elaborated in other published locations should therefore be sufficient here. During the pre-15th century history of Europe, especially since the emergence of Imperial Rome out of its military conquests during the same general period as the close of the Second Punic War. The power to make law came to be invested in a figure selected to perform the function of a pagan Pontifex Maximus, an emperor whose function was centered in his authority to arbitrate disputes respecting essential matters of doctrine and related practice among the diverse religious and cultural groups of which the subjects of that pantheonic tyranny were composed. In other words, like many of today's would-be busybodies, setting themselves up as the arbiters of peace, the Pontifex Maximus imputed to his own person the right to play God. The Roman Empire, in particular, was thus maintained as a permanent state of warfare, representing a process of hunting and culling the ranks of, even exterminating, some of the sundry religious and cultural groupings, either within the empire or at its periphery, as the associates of Brzezinski and Huntington adhere to such perspectives today.
Let's say I know we missed a footnote. So generally, like usual, at the end of a paragraph, if there's a footnote, somebody will do that. Kirsten, do you want to read the footnotes today?
I would be happy if I didn't have to. Also because people are sleeping here.
Oh, yeah. Okay, no, I appreciate the need for silence. Okay, Paul, you're up.
Yeah, I'll happily do it. Yeah, I mean, I've got my headphones on because my wife's asleep, but she won't be disturbed. Okay, 14. Forgive my German here. Friedrich Freiherr von der Heydt. I won't bother trying to read the title. The actually adopted form of the Roman imperial model was the outcome of crucial seminal negotiations between the faction leader Octavian, the latter Emperor Augustus, with representatives of the cult of Mithra in discussions held on the Isle of Capri. It was this alliance which enabled Octavian to defeat Antony and Cleopatra and founded the empire on that basis. The alliance of the Roman legions with the cult of Mithra was certified by the establishment of Capri as the hereditary property of the reigning emperor until the transfer of the title approximately a half-century later. It is this tradition among the imperial legions which forms the basis for both the Nazi Waffen-SS and the kindred philosophy of the US military utopians today. Ironically, according to usually reliable sources on such matters, it was the cult of Mithra which invented the theological doctrine of the hell unknown to the Hebrew theological tradition.
That's an explosive.
I was just about to say, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and it's certainly the first time I've come across that one.
Yeah, I've encountered that in a few other places, but that's you're going to get that a lot. There's a lot to unpack with a lot of these bombshell footnotes. But
I'd like to drop that one at a
Mithra was sort of the cult for the Praetorian Guard. So anytime you had an assassination of an emperor that was stepping out of line through the Praetorian Guard, they were all members of the cult of Mithra Mitre specifically. Yeah. And yeah, it seems like it was during the Second Punic War that it was infused through certain networks in Egypt who had allied with Rome against what am I thinking of here? Carthage, thank you. And Carthage had the alliance with Syria. That was it. Yeah, right. Thank you.
All right, we continue.
Unless, yeah, I mean, and everyone should just be reminded that, again, there's always challenging stuff, as we know. And if you do want to throw in a thought or a question at any time, feel free. But otherwise, yeah, let's sure continue.
Okay. This state of imperial depravity of ancient empires, such as Babylon and Rome, was also characteristic of the ultramontane faction of medieval society over the interval of 300 to 1480. It was this characteristic of medieval Europe under domination of the Venice-Norman alliance, which led into that vast depopulation and lunacy of the mid-14th century New Dark Age, a dark age of genocide, which one 20th century historian has characterized as a distant mirror of that troubled century's likely outcome.
That's just Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. Pretty good book. Okay.
By its essential implications of doctrine and practice, the oligarchical interest represented by the function of Pontifex Maximus divided the subjects of that imperium between the oligarchs and their lackeys on the one side, and the mass of the subject population, the human cattle, on the other. The human cattle fell into two grand subclasses, herded and hunted. For example, rogue cattle. Thus, the imperial law of the ultramontane tradition, by reducing herded and hunted subjects to cattle, reduced the rulers themselves, including the Pontifex Maximus himself, to the axiomatically implied status of a beast, like that which Britain's Thomas Huxley claimed to be, a beast from H.G. Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau. Thus, in an imperial or kindred social order, the mass of the human population of all categories was herded and called according to the perceived interest, or merely the caprices, of the ruling authority. Thus, in imperial society, including all those societies called variously ultramontane or integralist or globalized, the people exist for the convenience of the ruling power. Whereas in the modern form of sovereign nation state, as prescribed by our federal constitution, the state exists for the promotion of the welfare of the present and future population as a whole. I emphasize the most crucial point of relevance for shaping contemporary economic policies. The state must therefore be subject to control by the principle of its obligation to serve the promotion of the general welfare, to serve the common good. The moral right of the government to exist is conditional upon its efficient promotion of the general welfare of all of the present generations and their posterity. No type of rule of law may be tolerated which violates that principle. That notion of law, premised upon the notion of the common good, is the distinction of civilized government in modern society. That is the distinction which defines the modern sovereign nation-state republic. That distinction was the essence of the continuous quarrel between the patriots of the United States and the British monarchy over the interval 1776 till 1901, and the quarrel between President Franklin Roosevelt and the British monarchy's Prime Minister Winston Churchill during World War II. That is the essential difference between the American system of political economy, as exemplified by the work of Hamilton, the Careys, List, and Lincoln on the one side, and the Neo-Venetian British rentier financier system of Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, and the Mont Pelerin Society et al. On the other. This function of the principle of the general welfare is no mere precept, no mere tradition. It has a functional basis in the essential distinction between a man and an ape, between the human individual and all other living species. This connection is, As I shall indicate here, the key to understanding the physical principles of economy on which the entirety of a competent practice of statecraft, including economics, depends in an efficient and fundamental way. For reasons included in this chapter of my report, an efficient understanding of economics and of the economics issues underlying the present world crisis could not be attained within that medley of mysticism and reductionist fanaticism, which pervades today's usually taught classroom instruction. And sorry, I'm going to reread this.
Yes,
For
sir.
reason included in this chapter of my report, an efficient understanding of economics and of the economics issues underlying the present world crisis could not be attained within that medley of mysticism and reductionist fanaticism which pervades today usually taught classroom instructions in not only economics as such, but also much of the teaching of mathematics in particular and science in general. Therefore, the required understanding of the problems of policy shaping posed to us by the present crisis must include emphasis upon certain issues of scientific method. The feature of economic science on which I have placed emphasis in this chapter of the report is the deeper practical implications of the notion of physical economic cycles, especially long-range cycles.
So far, so good. Any particularly burning or pressing thoughts or questions based on what we've just read? Okay. Pascal, you're doing a great job. You want to keep reading?
Sure, I can. Section A, the physical basis for economic cycles. To serve the stated purpose of this report as a whole, I must now turn to define what I mean by the practice of a science of physical economy. I must show why and how that science is indispensable for understanding the predominant influence of long-range and other physical capital cycles in steering the evolution of the economy from point to point within such governing cycles. Economics, when properly defined as a branch of physical science, should be understood in terms of principles defined in that same way universal physical principles are. First, hypothesized, and later, proven experimentally in any competent form of physical science. In practice, the measurements to be made for society as a whole are to be made in reference to general cycles, long-ranging cycles of not less than 1 to 2 generations. This means that the measurement of performance in periods of less than a generation span must apply to the short-term measurements in economy, echoes of those same methods Kepler used for astrophysics in connection with his original discovery of a principle of universal gravitation.
Okay, so now we're infusing a little bit of astrophysics into our economic considerations slowly. He's going to dip into that, but we've got 2 footnotes here, 16 and 17. 16 being the bigger. So Paul?
Yep, 16. In applying the notion of physical science to economics, I signify the connections between science and culture, which I have taken up in comparing my work in the science of physical economy with the definition of the noosphere introduced by Vladimir Vernadsky. See, for example, Lyndon LaRouche Jr., The Economics of the Noosphere, Op. Cit. I emphasize that Vernadsky, while defining the principle of abiotic living and cognitive processes as reflections of mutually distinct classes of universal physical principles, nonetheless based the notion of scientific proof of principle for living and cognitive processes on necessary and sufficient evidence based on conclusively demonstrated paradoxes presented by effects of life and cognition on the abiotic domain.
Okay. And the footnote 17 is as documented in Kepler's 1609, the New Astronomy. Let's see where he goes.
Yep. So Kepler defines the universal physical principles of organization of the solar system from the standpoint of the long-range cycles, which are commensurate with completed orbits, and with the cycle of those combined planetary, lunar, and comets orbits, of which latter the system as a whole is visibly composed. The motion within any local, much shorter interval must be understood as an expression of the orbit as a whole, not, contrary to today's typically foolish Wall Street statistician, the orbit as the expression of the cumulative effect of localized motions. This is true for economic cycles. This is as true for economic cycles as it is for solar ones. This approach to the principle of cycles was, incidentally, the method underlying and permeating the original 1676 first published announcement of the discovery of the calculus by Gottfried Leibniz. Therefore, the principle I am invoking here is by no means a Johnny-come-lately innovation, but is an elementary and solid matter of scientific method, as it should be taught in all respectable secondary schools and universities today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just quick here, the idea of the bottom-up versus top-down approach to thinking about systems is very important, and that's sort of what he's alluding to here. Since if you look at the Keplerian method, is everyone here relatively familiar with what Kepler's method was, or what he did that made him special at the time he did it in the 17th century?
No.
Not so much. Okay, we're told in university he discovered three laws of astrophysics, three mathematically expressible formulas that are constants relatively, among the which are that planetary orbits occur in ellipses, not circles. Number two, that there's an equal area, equal time function anywhere on the orbit. If you take the same 3 days in any given area of a planet's journey on its elliptical orbit, the area swept out from the sun as a focal point to those two endpoints of beginning at the end of the 3-day cycle will be the same area. And finally, there's the third and harmonic law, which has to do with the square of the periods of each of the planets as they relate to the cube of their average distance from the sun. And there's a certain constant that also occurs there too. The first two laws were enumerated in his 1609 New Astronomy. And the key that made this work is that he didn't try to just do what everyone else was doing, which was taking statistical data points of different planets like Mars or Venus with the backdrop of the fixed stars behind them, and he wasn't just taking them and trying to extrapolate a whole system out of statistical parts. He had first and foremost in his mind from the very beginning a concept of the whole as a harmony, as one musical composition. And from his earliest writings in his early 20s all the way till the last days of his life, he was always refining and proving that thesis that came originally from his studies of Plato and the Timaeus was true. So he was verifying that the Pythagorean theory was actually valid, which turned out to be backed up by the fact that he came up with these laws as well, right? So LaRouche is just simply getting at that every economist today is trained in the incompetent method of simply taking random statistical data sets, and then they're told that they have to find more creative ways to linearly extend those data sets into some description of a whole system that they think they're mapping econometrically, which is insane. It doesn't work that way. You know, you would never be able to build up a sense of yourself if you just began with a couple of cells and their metabolic functions and cycles, and then just add and add on top of that to get the whole, you know, body of yourself. It wouldn't work for anything. But the fact that they think that they can do it that way, or they should, is the reason why they are always wrong about their forecasts, and they never see what's slapping them right in the face. So yeah, I thought that was just a nice astrophysical parallel that he was making. Jonathan, you made it. All right. Cool.
I just posted in the chat if people want to take a look at this. Obviously, the reading of the
what is it?
The books by Kepler would be better, but there's an image of the nested solids that Kepler has in his Mysterium Cosmographicum. So the first book that he published on his overall hypothesis of how the solar system basically works. There's a harmony embedded in the solar system that goes back to what Matt was saying about the Platonic solids.
Do people see it right there?
Yeah.
Right, that's it.
That's a great image, Pascal. Good find. Yeah,
it's
that's
a musical harmony. It's a musical harmony too, because my understanding of this is that the planetary orbits, for example, correspond to the same kinds of harmonies that you get in music. You know, starting from a tonic, for example, you know, thirds, fifths, etc., etc. There are ratios, and the distance from the sun, particularly, is you know, provides predictable orbits. I mean, it was one of the ways in which the outer planets were discovered based on Kepler's law. If Kepler's law is true, we should expect to find more planets at these particular points, because that corresponds to the musical harmonies that you know, correspond to Kepler's findings. And sure enough, when they looked, they found Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
Yeah, that's what he's going to publish that a bit later. But you're right. You're right. That's the image that you see there is the first hypothesis, which led him to all of the other subsequent discoveries of principle. And then in the harmony of the worlds, he devotes a whole chapter on the music, and yeah, that's it.
And it dates back to Pythagoras too. I mean, I don't know whether you've ever heard of the idea of the Pythagorean comma.
Yeah, actually.
Okay, I mean, the tempered musical tuning system that we use, that developed, I think, in the 18th century particularly, was a kind of a reunification, if you like, where, you know, a little bit of tweaking was done so that musical pieces could involve instruments that could be tuned in any key. Up until that time, in the natural progression, the natural harmonic progression, you'd get to a certain point where there were no notes. And that was known as the Pythagorean comma, which simply shows you that, you know, knowledge of that sort goes back a very, very long time. The first great unification in science was a musical unification.
That's
excellent.
great. Yes, exactly. Well, there are links between Johann Sebastian Bach and Kepler, actually.
Yeah.
The work
Yeah.
of Kepler.
Oh yeah.
If you look at the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, certainly you have an expression, a very beautiful expression of what you just mentioned.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I find it intriguing that it was, you know, supposedly secret knowledge at the time of Pythagoras.
Yeah.
They didn't have orchestras.
Well, I mean,
they didn't have orchestras back then that were playing pieces of music that could, you know, modulate through all 12 known keys, etc., etc. That wasn't what music was at the time. So it's fascinating that the ability to do that from a scientific point of view, the understanding of the knowledge of how you might do it, was part of the, you know, shall I say, secret knowledge or whatever.
No, absolutely. And I think, like you were saying, Pascal, I think it was Bach's teacher, what's his name, Forkel, who was the fellow who had studied and translated Kepler's works, that would have also animated his teaching method to Bach. as well, who would have appreciated. Because I mean, that's the idea also that and maybe at some point we might take some selections from Kepler's harmonies, and maybe just get some work through elements of it at some point. And yeah, this idea of like the 80/81 proportion, which was the Pythagorean comma, is something which tends to arise when you start adding the different octaves together, right? Isn't that it, Pascal? Like you have your one octave and you've divided into the major and minor nodes using the proper geometric cuts, and you find that it works all well and good internally in that one string, but as soon as you start adding more octaves to it, you find that all of a sudden these nice perfect mathematical proportions tend to break down. And these moments where they kind of break down are these commas, in a sense, where you get the fact that we're pressing a mathematical feature onto a nonlinear universe of reality, which will not necessarily, the universe is not mathematically perfect, right? It's kind of asymmetrical in that sense. It's balanced, but it's asymmetrical. So you won't always get a perfect imprint of your math onto that reality. And it's where the cracks happen. It's where those breaks happen that Pythagoras and Kepler and everyone who's actually creative that's what devotes their attention, is the singularity of where your math breaks down. That's the good stuff. That's where you're going to make discoveries. You don't care. It's not the stuff where it fits that interests you so much. That's kind of like, okay, it fits, useful, but not really where the new discoveries will arise, you know?
I mean, that whole world of resonance and frequency is, relevant now in terms of things like the electric universe theory.
Yeah. Yep.
New discoveries in that field are exactly along the lines that Matthew's just talking about. It's the bits in between that are worth looking at.
What was that, Pascal?
I was just going to add that we could have a fairly long discussion on that, but the way maybe to remember, well, to look into it a bit more is really like the steps that Kepler takes in the harmonies of the worlds. He looks back at what, like you mentioned, Paul, the Pythagorean, they had made some innovation, they had discovered things and tried to formalize them. But they were very much into the numbers per se, and the idea of astronomy coming in as in the last part of the quadrivium that they had: arithmetics, geometry, music, and astronomy. The astronomy, in a sense, is like the higher component and should reflect down to the other parts. But Kepler does that. I'm not sure that the Pythagorean were really had made the leap, and Kepler talks about that in his harmonies.
Right.
Yeah, a very relevant comment considering what we're reading today.
All right. Yeah,
part of what you're saying there is
these are fun segues.
LaRouche
These
is
are
talking
good
about right now.
Yeah. So let's I guess jump back into the text, and I'm sure we'll encounter some other food for discussion as we go along.
Right. So
the long cycles.
The long cycles, yeah. The long cycles built into the top-down design of the solar system do have a determining influence upon the circumstances in which life within the solar system depends. But for reasons I shall identify here a bit further on, the authority of those cycles does not prevent man from changing even the solar system itself, including changing it for the better, if but only gradually and over very, very long periods of sustained action, as living processes have transformed the Earth into a biosphere. The widely accepted methods among today's economists of measuring economic cycles in a simple statistical way commit the same blunder which Kepler exposed as the common anti-scientific error of the earlier astronomical dogmas of such diverse authorities as the Aristotelian Claudius Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Tycho Brahe. The use of the mere describing of nature as a substitute for discovering the underlying universal physical principles at work is the typical folly of those intellectually impaired statisticians who pretend to be economists, a folly abhorred in competent modern astrophysics since Kepler. It is for the reason of their refusal to recognize this issue of method that all the principal forecasters opposing my forecasts have been, at their best, simply incapable of providing competent projections of their own.
So what do you have here? We have number, did we hit 19?
18, 19.
It's a short one, yeah.
Okay, what's 19?
Thus, Mrs. Joan Robinson rightly ridiculed the foolish but dangerous Professor Milton Friedman as an apostle of post hoc ergo propter hoc. Friedman is the sort of menace his victims might prefer to curse in Latin. Yes, I would if I knew Latin.
Okay, good. The source of the failure of those forecasters has been, to a large degree, the incompetence of the way in which economics has usually been taught in all leading universities and often practiced in the profession in general. For example, if they had studied and understood Kepler's founding of the first approximation of a comprehensive mathematical physics and the developments in the same direction through Leibniz, Gauss, and Riemann et al. After Kepler, they would not have produced the often catastrophic effects typical of their work on business cycles and the continuing influence of that misguided work on policy shaping today. The importance of Kepler, which must be recognized among economists today, is that he was the founder of the first successful effort to establish a comprehensive form of mathematical physics, the first to establish a comprehensive method of attack, which freed science from the ivory tower mathematician's blackboard, and to civilize mathematics by bringing it into the real world, the world of universal physical principles, rather than the purely imaginary world of abstract ivory tower mathematical speculations. The first discovery of an experimentally defined principle of universal gravitation by Kepler is the point of departure from which all subsequent progress in developing a comprehensive form of modern physical science has emerged. So, it is inevitable that fertile scientific minds are impelled repeatedly to return to Kepler's arguments, as Albert Einstein did in his reappraisal of the importance of the discoveries of both Kepler and Bernard Riemann. Kepler recognized certain anomalies in the orbit of Mars, which had been overlooked by Brahe. This led him to recognize not only that the Mars orbit was elliptical in general form, but that the sun was located at one of the foci of that ellipse. Kepler observed that the measurements made by aid of his normalization of an observed orbit precluded the possibility of predicting statistically both the position and velocity of the planet's motion within an immediately subsequent portion of the orbital cycle as a whole. This required throwing away all as if at the blackboard varieties of Euclidean mathematics, such as those used by Ptolemy, Copernicus, Brahe, Galileo, et al. For Kepler, there must be a physically efficient intention, embedded in the solar system, which determine the characteristics of the orbit. By that use of the notion of intention, Kepler signified the existence of some corresponding experimentally demonstrable, efficient, universal physical principle, such as his original discovery of universal gravitation. This notion of a universal quality of intention by Kepler has been the definition of an experimentally validated universal physical principle among all competently educated persons ever since.
And I just say quickly on that point, the concept of intention is something which has really been attacked as something which not only exists in governing human societies, you know, this is where the word conspiracy theorist, right, has become a bad word, almost like a way to slander somebody is to say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. It's really what they're saying is you believe in intentions causally shaping human affairs. Stupid. And it's like, it's not just that, it's also that the idea that intention animates nature itself has been attacked too, because they say, well, intention comes from the human domain. Humans, you know, our minds are what create intentions, ideas, designs. So to say that that's already there in nature is anthropomorphizing the universe, right? Imposing your internal subjective poison onto the purity of the objective external universe. And it's like, okay, you're saying these people have popularly said that that's incompetent and bad and not scientific, but it's like every single great scientist, nearly every great scientist who really made revolutionary discoveries all thought that way. And they couldn't have made their discoveries, as they even point out in their own writings, without having that belief and faith that there is a causal intention that the universe is made the way it is because there is an intention in a design. They all talk about it. And even Plato talks about it in the Timaeus, right? That there's this causal principled nexus, that it is the way it is and not any other way, for certain reasons of it being judged by the creator to be the most harmonic and beautiful the way it is. Doesn't mean that it's intended to not change or that it's static, but that it's because it also plays into and allows for free will to you know, feedback and transform it and make it even better. And because it can always be made better, that's why it's the best. And Kepler talks about that, Plato talks about that, Augustine talks about that, Leibniz talks about that. And these are the ones who are making discoveries, and right? Not the people who reject it, who don't make discoveries. They just impose their ivory tower opinions onto what they think science should be.
Right. It's not just a cold machine. It's really something you have to, from your own point of view, have to try to understand how you are part of it, like why it produced humans. Also,
Yeah.
they can then reflect back on what it is we're part of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the beautiful component of it, which is where, like, yeah, you always get that in that sense. When LaRouche talks about systems and cycles, it's always without assuming there's this bridge between the humans looking at and understanding the cycles that we're also a part of, and but also understanding that we shape them too. So whereas the other Malthusians who also talk about cycles and systems, and you have the contradictive cycles, and we have the Schumpeter business cycles, all of these other things, they all presume this absolute wall between human beings who they are just managing like gods, right? As little statistical elements on their data set. And the universe, which is this cold universe of just dead cycles, right? That we have to just abide by in some mathematical equilibrium. Different world, very similar things to between what LaRouche or Kepler or Leibniz are doing and what these creepy people are doing, but very different concept, very different moral philosophy, which gets very different effects.
Yeah. I continue.
Should Pascal continue, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
All right. Therefore, as I shall summarize the case here, anyone who would wish to become a competent economist should study the pivotal ontological paradox which led Kepler to a crucial discovery of a universal physical principle, in this case, gravitation. Kepler recognized that although the orbit as a whole was observed and knowable with experimental precision, the velocity and position of the planet at any time could not be predicted as a simple statistical projection of its immediately preceding action. Kepler's measurements led the way to Leibniz's future development of the calculus by showing that the orbit fit such rules as equal areas, equal times. For the case of the angular measurement, for the case that the angular measurement was made with respect to the relatively fixed position of the sun at one focus of the ellipse. The measurable fact of equal areas, equal times pointed to the existence of an efficient agency existing beyond statistical comprehension of the mere moment-to-moment motion observed for the planet itself. Kepler's development of the concept of the relationship among the harmonic ratios of orbits in the ordering of the solar system as a whole was a continuation of that same method and approach. The same class of problem confronts the attempt to solve the mystery concerning the way in which long-term economic cycles interact with short-term changes in economic policy. In examining long to medium-term economic cycles, we must adduce the demonstrable physical principles characteristic of each phase of the cycle and assess the local phase of the ongoing process from the standpoint of an experimentally based insight into the systemic characteristics of that process, which defines the cycle as a whole.
All right. I think, Paul, you there? No. Okay. For relevant readers, I'm using the term characteristic.
Sorry,
here.
Matt, I am here.
Oh, okay.
Which one is it, 20 or 21?
20.
For relevant readers, I am using the term characteristic here in the strict sense of the usages of Gauss-Riemann. I emphasize the highlights of some extremely relevant implications of that usage at a relevant later point here.
Thank you.
To restate that point with an eye on the referenced work of Kepler, there is something outside, behind the sometimes apparently simple statistical projection of trends, which controls and accounts for the ironical, ultimately contradictory relationship between short-term performance determined statistically and medium to long-term cycles. The challenge presented is, therefore, is there some ontologically paradoxical, undeniable empirical evidence which points our cognitive powers toward an appropriate search for a relevant hypothesis which might, in turn, lead us to an experimentally defined universal physical principle? That external action by a principle is embodied within the cycle itself, that more or less in the same sense that it is the orbit as a whole which determines the short-term motion of the planet. In astrophysics or economics, it is a universal physical principle which is both embodied within the cycle as a whole and which, pending the efficient introduction of a newly added long-term cyclical principle, subsumes the idiosyncrasies observable in effect at each moment. Therefore, in physical science and the methods of mathematics appropriate to that science, the secret of competent forecasting in general is the same which Leibniz developed in his unique original discovery and continued refinement of the calculus. This was a discovery which met precisely the challenge which Kepler had bequeathed to future mathematicians. We must discover the cycle first, and then assess the local action within that functional frame of reference. It is the long-term cycles which are of the greatest importance. Therefore, in all my forecasting, I have always forecasted from a long-range cyclical standpoint, as Gauss, in his development of his general notions of curvature, and Riemann later, successively perfected this conceptual approach for mathematical physics in general. Reliable long-range economic forecasting depends upon that conceptual approach. Yes, the human does intervene in this. But how? Effective intervention occurs by acting, in effect, upon the long-range economic cycle itself, rather than upon the local interval of that process. The purpose of economic forecasting is to discover how to intervene in the relatively short term, if possible, to change the characteristics of the long-range cycle in which events are currently trapped. By changing the characteristics of the long-range cycle, we are able to change the effect which the changed long-range cycle now imposes upon the local interval.
Does anybody, this might be a good opportunity to just think about an example or two in the world that we live in. Like, can anyone think of an example of, let's say, a decision that is either has been made or could be made in the economy that affects short-term cycles at the expense of long-term cycles, or decisions that are made in the short term but that affect in a positive way or a negative way a long-term cycle?
I could think of one.
Mm-hmm.
But if other people have examples, I would be happy to hear them. No?
Not off the top of my head, but let's hear yours, Pascal.
Well, I'm just thinking of any government which will actually go against the typical policies which were described in the first part of this paper. You know, we discussed the overall change back in the 60s and 70s, where you had governments that had long-term policies of highly developed technologies, or highly heavy investment into new technologies. And so a government which, in our phase of collapse of nowadays, a government that would actually go against these kind of policies will induce, maybe not on the short term, but on the long term, a new kind of paradigm.
In a negative way. Yeah.
In a positive, yeah.
Oh, a positive way, yeah.
It could be negative, like the example I gave before was negative, but
yeah. I was thinking about the example of Germany, which had the only functional magnetic levitation railway as a prototype and in action anywhere in the world before even China. And they chose, for a variety of reasons, to cancel and abort that technology, which was originally designed to be applied more broadly, right? Which would have the effect of transforming the cycles of, like, think about all of the things that move in cycles on a day-to-day basis. It's not just people waking up, going to work, but you have the production cycles in agriculture, the products that are produced in even raw materials, in mining and other things, in timber, but they have to move from point A to point B. They have to be transformed at point B, right, into something useful that are then distributed to point C. And somewhere down the line, they end up in a store or whatever. Then they're bought, and they have to be transported to people's homes, whatever that case may be, or that are used for capital goods in industry or something more advanced. So you have all of these cycles that always have to happen, and they have to be transported by either trucks or by like cargo, rail or ships. And so had the decision, that very small time decision, maybe it was partially for monetary considerations to save money because it's so expensive, and it might have, given us more money to not invest in maglev, whatever the case was, they chose not to do it, and they held back their entire system into the old slow cycles that could have been qualitatively transformed if they had done something differently. That was the sort of thing I was thinking about in a negative way again.
Yeah, I'd go one step further, Matthew, and include things like the offshoring of industry.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it might have looked good in the
that-
short term. We could have made a lot of money in the short term doing that.
We made a lot of money in the short term, but if you look at the world today, I mean, even for the globalists, it's coming back to bite them big time.
Right.
I mean, by empowering China the way that they have, and even India to a lesser degree, you look at the geopolitics of the world today, and you talk about this all of the time, of course, it really is coming back to bite them. That short-term decision, profits, et cetera, has killed off the American economy in large measure. It's financialized the whole bloody economy and turned everything into a rentier situation. That's where profits are. But it is now coming back to bite them. One of the perfect examples of this is, your Eurasian thing. Just the article that you put up on the degree of magnetic levitation railway in China, the only country in the world really that uses it, and not a single, foot of such railway exists in America. And you sit there and you scratch your head and you go, wow, that when you read something like that, it's stark.
Yeah.
What could be done in America, what could have been done worldwide, and what is actually being done.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah.
Matt, I don't know. This is more like a market view, not not saying it's a policy per se, but this OPEC decision to cut back 2 million barrels oil per day, because in the short-term decisions in previous years were, we don't need to invest in hydrocarbons, we need to invest more into green, so-called green energy and so forth. And this caused lack of investment into the hydrocarbon market and investment to the oil. And now the OPEC is more or less forced to take this decision to have oil at a specific price to encourage investment for the long-term cycle to continue. Because if they don't, the cycle could actually go straight down in a short period of time because of these policies that took place in the previous years. That's how that short term, those policies were short term, but in the long term, it could actually, destroy the market. Well, the investment into that industry. Yeah,
it's an interesting way of putting it. I think that's definitely, you're right, as a component. I don't know if that's the only reason. I think some of this might have also been like a little bit of geopolitical
yes,
as
of
well.
Course, of course.
Yeah.
But on another point, yeah, I think you're introducing a way of thinking about it as well, which has value. And I think you're touching on something there, which it's like, yeah, we've made it so impossibly difficult to produce hydrocarbons in the current green banking pact economy where, like credit has been withheld from industries trying to develop hydrocarbon projects as part of the Mark Carney Great Reset design. And they've, it is definitely affected the value of this, I remember that, I got to look into it a little bit more, but I know in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, he's often attacked for trying to create some controlled inflation in the early 30s, in especially the agricultural sector. The reason for it, though, he shouldn't be attacked, but rather applauded, because all of the farms were going bankrupt. Why? It was because
prices were going down.
the prices of the agricultural goods were so artificially low that the farmers, when they sold their produce, couldn't even afford to pay for the maintenance of their own farms, to pay their employees. So they were all going bankrupt because the prices were too low. The prices had to be increased. And that was part of the designs by Wall Street and others to drive the economy into the shitter throughout the Great Depression. So there's certain types in that sense of inflation that was needed so that the producers could actually carry out their business and sustain themselves. So maybe I think what you're saying sort of reflects what I recognize in Roosevelt's time. I didn't look at it in our current time that way, but I'm gonna definitely do so based on what you just said.
Because from our point of view is that OPEC, they just represent the producers and the best interest of the producers, not necessarily consumer, because obviously short term there will be increase in price. However, they're looking at their own self-interest, in which this is their business and they need to keep this going as long as possible. And they will do whatever it takes to keep the business long term in that cycle continuing, not adopting policies or encouraging policy adoption that will destroy our industry or make our industry go in such a decline, where it might fall off a cliff, and maybe difficult to get new investment at that cliff moment.
Right. Good point.
I find it laughable at the moment. In the last week and a half, I've been reading about that decision by OPEC, for example, and how it doesn't favor Biden and his electoral ambitions with the midterms coming up. But the US is talking about sanctions against Saudi Arabia for such a decision. And Saudi Arabia is now saying they want to join BRICS. That's exactly
amazing.
Fits in exactly with what Jonathan is saying, that they're seeing their future in a different direction. They want to align with something that actually provides them with a future for their mainstay industry, which is oil. Yeah. And the BRICS nations and the rejection of the Western globalist tradition at the moment seems to be, to them, their way forward.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's incendiary, geopolitically, that's for sure. I mean, America's not liking it and Biden's certainly not liking it.
Sure. Yep. Cool. Well, I think we definitely get an idea how these cycles express themselves. And I would just say on a qualitative level, back in we had a contact, a friend of ours who had been the president of a union for Hydro-Quebec. And he was saying once that back in the 70s, a lot of the Hydro-Quebec, which is all hydroelectricity, right? Their engineers were all studying nuclear physics and nuclear engineering because the understanding was that there was going to be a transformation of the energy basket towards the atom. And I would think there were 3 nuclear reactors, John CDU 1 to 3, that were built up. But it was all sabotaged. It was all aborted because the Malthusians took control and basically said, no, all of these what we have today is all that we're going to permit can ever happen. And the new leap into next generation tech that would qualitatively transform the knowledge cycle, the production cycle, everything, that we're not going to do that anymore. And we're just going to stay in that dependency with the obsolete technologies. And we're going to keep using coal and oil and natural gas until they run out or whatever, until we can create scarcity and then justify something ugly with that artificial scarcity that we're going to end up creating down the line, which now we're living in the wake of those decisions again, which could have been completely mitigated if we had just made a different trajectory. And again, this idea of trajectory, right? Orbits is a very fun way to think about economics and astrophysics at the same time. I have to do something quick. I've drank way too much water. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna 2-minute break. Not even. I'm gonna be right back. If you guys want to read, where are we? It's
illustrate the point.
Yeah. Feel free. I'll try to be fast.
Sure. Okay, let's take it.
Oh boy. Yeah, I have a lot of cords tied around my leg. Okay. Bye.
All right. To illustrate that point, when we discover a new universal physical principle, and then apply that principle intentionally to a process previously defined in terms of earlier discoveries of such principles, the addition of that new universal principle changes the characteristic action in every interval of the process. It changes the characteristic effect of willful forms of human action upon the universe. The development of the notion by Leibniz and Bernoulli, for example, that isochronic pathways in physical processes are implicitly those of a catenary rather than, for example, a cycloid, typifies the mathematical physical idea of applying a new notion of extended magnitude, i.e., a universal physical principle, to change a previously assumed characteristic of a process. I don't know if people know what is the difference between a catenary and a cycloid.
No, do you know? Catenary is a new word for me.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, so it's pretty easy to understand, but it's different. But when you have a hanging chain, no, I'm just using this right now. It's not exactly the best, but I don't have anything better here. But if you have a hanging chain, it's going to describe a certain curve. Yeah, there you go, Matthew. So check on Matthew's
Up rope.
that would be a catenary. It's a hanging chain, so it has weight, it has material, and it creates a certain shape when it's under the force of gravity. Whereas a cycloid is a curve, which is could be seen as closed in a sense, but is not from the same process. It's a curve also, but it's created by a circle. If you had a point, there you go. Again, if you have a point that you stick on that circle and you trace, or a pencil, you put a pencil on that device and you rotate it, it's going to create a certain curve that's going to continue as you're going on the straight line. It creates a curve, right?
Yeah, like just quick, like imagine that you're just tracing out like that point where my finger is on the this very painful exercise device. So if you just like traced on the wall, I'm not going to draw on our wall, unfortunately.
No.
But if you just traced out one point on the wheel as it is rotating, right? You just continued it on and you kept on tracing it out, you would end up getting a curve that looked like this, like that, right? But it wouldn't be half circles. It wouldn't be even half ovals. It's a different species of curvature that occurs specifically by rolling a circle in a straight line, right? So yeah, sorry, Pascal, go for it. That was
He doesn't mention it here, but you could also bring the point that it's different from a conic section. You have sections that you can, when you have a cone, you can actually cut into cones, and it's going to give you different shapes. The hyperbole, there you go. Yeah, the section, the parabola. Yeah, so you got them, hyperbola and parabola. There you go.
yeah. So that's the ellipse here.
Circle,
Circles,
ellipse, that's
ellipse.
yeah. There you go.
This one's the parabola, and that's the hyperbola, right?
Yep. There you go. So these are also curves, but they are from a different process. They were not generated the same way as, for example, the hanging chain, the catenary. Yeah.
Right, and the catenary looks it approximates the parabola, but it's not a parabola, which a lot of mathematicians like Descartes tried to fudge the data because he was like, it's close enough. Let's just pretend it is, and that screwed up a lot of people and held back scientific discoveries for a long time until some honest people actually tried to tackle it honestly by getting across that no, it's not a parabola. It is its own thing, which you need to develop. And this is, I guess, where the discovery of the calculus by Leibniz emerged out of that study. So, yeah.
Okay. Good for that. That is the key to any competent appreciation of the role of scientific and technological progress in bringing about a medium to long-term trend of increase in the productive powers of labor, as this effect is expressed in the short to medium term. This is, in fact, the only true source of the increase in the physical economic rate of profit. That, in short, is what I mean by changing the cycle as a whole, as the way to alter the characteristic behavior in the localized part of that process. That is the kind of systemic effect we are attempting to induce when apply a new principle expressed as a technology to an already established productive process or product design. I repeat, for emphasis, this kind of transformation in characteristic is the only true source of physical economic profitability of an economic process. The complex of principles expressed by the process has the quality of a more or less long-range cycle. By integrating an added principle through the medium of new technology, we transform the characteristic of that cycle and thus transform the characteristic action in the local situation.
Okay, we got footnote 21.
This defines the indispensable function of the notion of Riemannian manifolds in addressing the subject of economic cycles. The efficient introduction of a new universal physical principle changes the physical geometry of the economic cycle as a whole, thus changing the characteristic of the system and thus changing the value of the local action.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, I don't know. Pascal, do you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, there's different ones you can think about. I mean, any type of new technology that you're introducing into an economy is going to have a shift in the way that things are being done, the time they take, how it reshapes the whole organization of society. So you can, we could use the steam engine, for example, and how it was really a revolution in how it made work different. And so the power of labor of one man was completely multiplied by the machine, by the design, which was implemented in society at that point, which reorganized the whole society overall. So that's one example I can think of.
An even more contemporary example is the just-in-time production process, invented by the Japanese in the 60s that pretty much took over the whole of the industrial world.
That's another one.
I mean, it was a system that literally transformed the way economics was done, particularly in terms of, stocks and things like that. Everything arriving just in time for the production process. Has its own problems. There's a break in supply, as there is these days, but it was a very transformative economic process.
Mm-hmm.
Would you consider the just internet as one of that same idea or not?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Any idea that
it took a while for it to become a real marketing scheme, but that's what it's become.
Yeah. Like I was thinking a little bit about, I'm going to try to find maybe one or two good, and there's some good animation videos on YouTube that I think do a decent job introducing the idea of Riemannian surface functions, which are different. It's like a different way of thinking about geometry than the naive Euclidean idea or Cartesian, which is the same thing as saying like Euclidean, I think, idea of geometry that we're often introduced to. You know, like you've got an XYZ grid and you kind of like just chart and place things, objects in that XYZ grid that goes on for infinity in all directions, right? That gives us a naive and false idea of three-dimensional space and volume. Because the reality is that the world, the universe, the fabric of physical space-time doesn't obey that way. It doesn't abide by that. We find that it's impossible to even try to make a straight line, as even using the best, most concise laser technology we have, we find that on a very subtle level, there's still curvature everywhere. There's always curvature that is related to the fact that light and the medium it moves through is affected by the so-called material objects, which have a certain interplay with the invisible fields shaping the contour of that so-called space, which is not empty. In the Euclidean world, it's supposed that there is such a thing like vacuum or empty space between objects. That's not, we don't see any evidence of that ever being true. So in Riemann and Kepler before him, and there's this whole current, a continuous current of ideas that creatively evolve and build on each other in opposition to this absurd false current of fake science that we're sold as being the only science of Western society in our modern universities, because who's running the universities? There's this appreciation for, and again, Riemann is like one of the people who took this to the heights that Einstein appreciated very much, Planck appreciated, and LaRouche, you'll find he always writes about the importance to review what Riemann was able to revolutionize. And again, like you often see it in things like hydrodynamics and things that Da Vinci was looking at. When you have like water moving with a current, there's certain geometries, right? And you introduce a factor into like a flowing water system, and you introduce, let's say, a twig into that water system, and you'll find all of a sudden these new vortices that are forming, a vortice, you know, and other forms of moving mobile geometries that have a certain structure to them that end up taking shape. You get it in all sorts of things like hydrodynamics and stuff like that. And so LaRouche is saying that in studying and thinking about the geometry of a human economy, that's a good model to have in mind, not this dead object-based Euclidean geometry, but more of a living geometry like that. And Riemann was the best language that he created to map that out and understand how it changes, not just how you describe it, but how you improve, how it's transformed from one set to another. You know. Anyway, I'll try to find a video and I'll share it either by probably next week. That's how we'll start next week, is we'll look at a Riemann video.
Would I be right in assuming that, and I don't know how relatively recent it is or the history of it, but the mathematics of topology.
Yeah.
The mathematics
that's
of
what it
surfaces. Is. I mean, I've watched a few videos on that, you know, and I'm not a mathematician, so it's a bit of a strain for the brain and everything, but it seems to me that fits into what you're talking about now. And my understanding is that it is a relatively recent form of mathematics.
100%. Yeah, that's what Gauss was doing exactly, was like finding ways to measure topology, and Riemann was his student and took it even further, but you're right. That's exactly it.
Yeah. There are some very good, if you want to go searching for them, Matthew, the ones that I found anyway, some very good videos on that, on the notion of topology, which explains it. If I say in layman's terms, it's still a bit of a brain stretch if you have no real mathematics background like me, but I had a reason for wanting to look at it, but I found it fascinating, even though it was, you know, to some degree, the maths anyway is beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, it's accessible. Well, yeah, send me some links. Send me some links. I'll try to find a good one.
Okay, yeah, sure.
There was a big project at the time, beginning of the 19th century. Really, well, when you're talking about topology, right, you're trying to understand the shape of the surface, you know, of places, and it can be like we looked at these geometrical images, but it could be also for the Earth. So there was this idea of also shaping having a real good mapping of the Earth, so the surveyors, but also that brings in other things that we don't really see, but that we can, well, we don't see as it's not present as a physical thing, but it has a physical effect, which is gravitation. So the idea of mapping the magnetic field of the Earth was also a big endeavor at the time of Gauss, at the beginning of the 19th century. Yeah, so it plays into exactly what you said.
Mm-hmm.
It's another aspect of fun. Go looking in the electric universe world these days. There's a lot of new developments in that regard too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Fun. All right. So we have time for maybe another page or two. We're at page 15 of 66. Wow. All right. That's okay. That's okay. This is good. This is quality over quantity. That's good.
Okay. Let's go.
Let's go.
A long-term cycle is the reflection of the action performed by a complex of universal physical principles upon the universe. In scientific and technological progress, we may correct erroneous assumptions from the past, but usually, in practice, we do not otherwise change any of these principles. We bring additional such principles into play voluntarily, just as we do through the successful discovery and application of any previously unrecognized universal physical principle. Thus, by bringing an additional such principle into play, thus altering the long-term cycle, we alter the characteristic quality of action, the systemic quality of action, in the short term. In other words, we change the physical geometry of the system. This alteration is a typical form of anti-entropic action. Such is the nature of the determining relationship of scientific progress to physical productivity of labor per capita and per square kilometer. There was footnote 22.
22, in the sense of a Riemannian differential geometry.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, all right.
The most commonplace foolishness practiced by my opponents in the name of forecasting and related analysis today is that exemplified in the extreme by the pathetic case of the Mont Pelerin Society's Professor Milton Friedman's post hoc ergo propter hoc school of forecasting. The reading of trendline charts for purposes of forecasting real economic processes is a form of sheer buncombe into which contemporary financial accountants are prone to fall all too often. The past certainly does predetermine the conditions on which the present and future will be built. But the simple statistical reading of a trend from the recent past tells us nothing so much as the fact that the believer in such methods of forecasting has learned less than nothing from the past 5 centuries of scientific progress. We had a footnote 23.
A characterization of Friedman deliciously served by Cambridge's Mrs. Joan Robinson. Friedman, like the typical Gila monster, may not be an impressive intellect, but he is no less nasty on account of that shortfall. As far as I'm concerned, you can't say enough bad things about Milton Friedman, the inventor of the top-down philosophy.
All right. Thus, there is a deep scientific principle involved in that distinction of economies from mechanical systems. I summarize that crucial topic as follows. The long-term rise or fall of economies is determined, as I have just pointed out, by the fact that healthy economies are of a special quality of characteristic, which is defined by an intrinsically anti-entropic process. In effect, any competent measurement of the characteristic features of an economy, which is increasing its potential relative population density, is a measurement of the reflection of anti-entropy, or want of it, in the cyclical aspects of the process as a whole. It is the intervention by means of an added universal physical principle or a technology derived from that principle that long range and other economic cycles are profitably transformed in their characteristics. The physical economic profit generated locally or in the large is an expression of implicitly measurable local anti-entropy. Thus, competent long-range economic analysis is focused upon discerning functions of technological change, which either increase the entropy of the cycle or its anti-entropy.
Anybody need a quick definition of entropy, anti-entropy, or are we okay with that?
We're good.
We're
good.
Yeah.
We're good? All right, good.
We read Vernadsky. Ah.
All right.
Good. So, in summary of what has been said on this matter thus far, in defining any long-term or medium-term cycle, the immediate object is to determine whether the trajectory is toward an increase or decrease of the entropy of that cycle over its term. The function of informed intervention is to take some action, either to remove an axiomatic feature of the cycle, which increases the entropy of the cycle as a whole, or which, happily, will increase the expressed anti-entropy of the cycle. True profit, as defined from the standpoint of a science of physical economy, expresses a net gain attributable to anti-entropic action within that economy. No other definition of profit is acceptable for purposes of long-term forecasting of the course of physical economies. Belief in a zero-growth model of a stable, so-called sustainable economy is not an option which will permit an economy to survive over the relevant long term. In a matter of organizing a recovery from the physical economic depression brought about through a defective monetary financial system, as today, the essential mission must be to reverse the characteristic of the physical economy as a whole from a state of self-aggravated entropy to one of significant anti-entropy. This is accomplished primarily not through the simple sum total of individual productive and related actions, but through changing the characteristic of the system considered as a whole. The value of production is not the sum total of estimated value added at local points. It is the relative anti-entropy of the economy considered as an indivisible whole. The desired happy outcome is accomplished by a combination of measures. Increase the ratio of useful employment relative to the potential labor force as a whole. Raise the level of technology relative to infrastructure, production, and design of products and processes within the whole. In the course of this report, I shall clarify that approach to bringing about a general economic recovery. Rather than merely describing my relevant discoveries respecting the specific point just made, I prefer that you should actually know what I am describing here. I describe the initial phases of my original discoveries in the science of physical economy, the discoveries on which all of my successes relative to the work of my professional and other rivals have depended. These are the principles upon which competence in economics depends today, especially under conditions of crisis, in which all conventional habits fail. These are the principles which dominate any competent discussion of the situation in the US and world economies today.
Good. That's, I think, a good spot to end. And the next section is going to be titled "The Trouble with Sense Perception." I love it. So that's going to be a good meaty entry point next week. But yeah, it's no one has an excuse in the political sphere to say that they were ignorant of what has befallen the world today. It was not something which started, as I think we all have come to realize, it didn't start with coronavirus. This thing goes way, way further back in time to decisions that were made in some cases before most of us, Paul accepted, were born.
Thanks for reminding me of that, Matthew.
But he was too young to be held responsible, so you're okay, Paul.
Yeah. And I rejected most of the economics I was taught anyway, mate.
Yeah, you took a stand at the right when you needed to. That was good. You're okay.
I'm not a believer in entropy.
Can you change the characteristic of the system? Like, what's an example of changing the characteristic of the system in that last couple of paragraphs?
Yeah. You have a thought, Pascal? Or?
Well, I think the example of just-in-time production is a perfect example there.
Of what production?
Just in time.
Oh.
I mean, I'm not trying to hold it up as a model that we should all be working on, but the way in which it worked in the world when it first was put into place by the Japanese transformed them into world leaders. In the 80s they were dominant, for goodness sake, and most of it was based on the savings involved in that particular production method. They were able to achieve a level of competitiveness relative to other economies, and other economies, by virtue of that, started copying it. I mean, it's a perfect example of this, the cyclic thing that we're talking about now, because whilst the process itself, the idea of in a production process, you make sure that everything that is needed in that production process arrives just in time for when it's needed. I mean, it's a wonderful system until you get a breakdown.
Exactly.
And the minute you get a breakdown, well, you just don't have control anymore over the items of supply. And you're seeing that, deliberately engineered or otherwise. You're seeing a breakdown in that at the moment. But the initial system itself, I don't want to say from a theoretical point of view, because it worked. It was real. It certainly was a dominant new system of production at the time that it was introduced.
Yeah, I think what LaRouche is mentioning in the parts that we read, you would have to think about not just in terms of maybe short-term success, but long-term survival of the human species. Because as you said, it could be good in a relative way at a certain time, but there are like political reasons for that, geopolitical also, that we could bring in terms of like what Japan is after World War II, and the American occupation, the very rapid industrialization or modernization of the processes there. So that's all. These are all interesting things to look at. But I think that he really what he wanted to stress was the idea of how, by the application of certain policies, you could actually, or technologies, you could really increase the potential, the relative population density of the planet. And so it could be on a positive way or on a negative way. So we could look at what Roosevelt was doing back in the 30s, the TVA, these kind of projects, which made sure that the productivity for food, the industries, what I think he was mentioning at the beginning of the paper, he was mentioning the arsenal of democracy. So the idea of the Rust Belt, well, what we call now the Rust Belt, but Detroit, also Baltimore, all of these places, which really fast track develop things that never existed before, the new technologies, new ways of building things.
Yeah, Henry Ford's
I would
production process.
use these kind of examples. Yeah.
Henry Ford's production process.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, think of the world before that production process and after it was applied.
Yeah.
That's a way. Yeah. I was thinking like you were saying, Pascal, the idea of the potential population is always like a really big thing. LaRouche always tends to hammer at. You're going to see that again and again. Potential relative population density. It's a term that the more you read this man's writings, the more that becomes like hammered into your head as something really important. And the way that it's different from the population density, right? Because it's like there's two coexistent dynamics: potential and actual, right? Now the actual is something which you can map out. There's like a whatever 8.3 billion or something people on the earth today as it stands, right? So there's a certain population density associated with different regions, right? And that population density is determined by certain things that have to do with whether or not that region has healthcare, water systems, water treatment, sanitation, what type of road transportation, so there are these basic factors that determine the how many people you can have in a certain being supported in a certain region, right? Whether it's a desert, whether it's a tundra, or whether it's a forest, will also determine how much food you can grow, right? So there are these things you can wrap your mind around that shapes that. But the potential is and that changes sort of in a gradualistic way, right? There's always people being born, dying all the time, right? In society, it's kind of like a gradualistic process in a continuum. Whereas the potential, you could say that, like, I've seen a study that that was conducted in the early 70s that sort of did an audit of the rates of production and everything that was going on industrially. And they basically said that at that time they could sustain, back in like 1974 or so, about 20 or so billion people was possible to be sustained at a decent quality of life in that time. Now, today, you could say that might be less because we didn't do the things that were our healthy habits of maintaining infrastructure, improving infrastructure, applying new technologies. Those were healthy habits, healthy traditions. We broke away from that. So now you could say maybe the population potential is lower. It's not natural. It's not lower because nature says it had to be. It's made lower because we made bad decisions that we applied to action. And that's something which you could say changes in a more discrete way. Because when you apply a new discovery, let's say like Henry Ford's production, or let's say Benjamin Franklin's discovery of electricity, right? Earlier on, as soon as that discovery is made, it doesn't necessarily change the potential for the species. But at what point does it? At what point does the potential population of humanity change? Well, so you have to get it out of the simple mind of an individual discoverer who is a creative, brilliant person, and so he has to communicate it, and it has to take the form of new inventions that then begin to apply in an improved way the production process. So all of a sudden, you can have a leap of God knows how many, like literally 1 second when you're ignorant of that discovery, of that truth. You're ignorant, that potential is lower. The knowledge itself causes the increased potential now, which would not otherwise exist, to sustain a more qualitative and quantitative people. So it's this reciprocal, like subjective, objective, right? The individual human to the universe and back and forth again, that interplay that creates this growth that is otherwise anti-entropic. And if you embrace ignorance and you destroy discoveries and you know, you like that we've been doing for 40 years, you destroy the electric universe approach to science, you destroy medical discoveries because you want to keep people addicted to pharmaceutical products, all of these other things. Yeah, sure, you're going to constrict, you're going to have a smaller and smaller invisible field of potential that's going to start pressing on your actual people. And when that potential goes lower than your actual people, then you're in a big crisis. And I feel like that's sort of what they're trying to do right now.
Where we are now, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that can be changed though. Always can be changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking, this is the example previously, we were looking for how it changed the characteristic. And, you know, like we were discussing, the internet was brought up, I think. And I was thinking about it. I was like, not sure, not exactly like the internet per se, but you could say that basically in terms of the production capabilities, like the invention of fiber optics and all of these components, which now bring about these that are used in what we call internet today, that has an advantage. But this is all part of, in a sense, like you have a blue collar worker, for example, and the improvement in technologies is going to sustain, you know, infrastructure, is going to sustain production of food, production of goods. These are all like the basics that we need, not just for industries, but for household. And LaRouche goes into this into his book, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. But you really have to consider all of the energy of the system, all of what is being produced. It's not all going to go for the production. There's going to be a bit of waste also, but that's why you need to have more free energy. So you need to increase, like the idea of profit. Let's say profit is, you know, you exchange profit for energy, for free energy. The more profit you gain, or you can actually afford to make, you can actually then reinvest to a better way of producing, into making discoveries like the fiber optic, like whatever, you know, new energy production, new power production. And so you have, like, it's a very interesting, I mean, I'm not going to explain all of that tonight, but it's a very interesting process to look at these things and try to understand, like, so what, you know, what is the basis, and how does it go all around in society? How does it shape the way that we're doing things, or not? You know, like today we're not actually increasing. There might be like financial profit, but clearly it's not reinvested into the real economy.
Right.
So that's also an issue.
Yep. Good point.
I can give you a great example of how that goes wrong too. In when was it? When the Labor Party was previously in power in Australia back in pre-2013, they introduced the idea of a national broadband system, which was going to future-proof Australia. It was going to cost billions, 32, 34, 40 billion or whatever at the time. But essentially it was going to deliver internet to virtually, you know, fiber optic internet to virtually every household in the major populated areas. There would be some Wi-Fi for towns and remote places. Now, when the change of government came, the new Liberal Party, they, you know, that system was certainly popular, you know, with people at least. You know, they could see that this would future-proof Australia, the huge amounts of data that could come down the fiber optic lines. But what did the Liberal Party do? They delivered a system whereby they brought fiber optics to the end of the fucking street and delivered all of what was coming down the fiber optics to your house via the pre-existing copper wires. And it's hilarious. In the time that I've lived here in the Philippines, and I've been back to Australia a couple of times, it is so noticeable that the internet here in the Philippines is so much better than what passes for the internet in Australia. And it wasn't that way when I lived there. You didn't have breakdowns. You didn't have, you know, really crappy systems where every second day, you know, a major internet provider would go down. You know, the banks would suddenly not be operational for 2 days because of a glitch in, you know, their systems, et cetera, et cetera. But I did find it quite laughable. And, you know, nobody's going to brag about the internet system here in the Philippines as being, you know, first world or anything like that. But it is more reliable, more productive, and some cases, you know, depending on what you pay, faster than what you'll get in Australia. And it was a sabotage.
Mhm.
It was a deliberate sabotage. You know, I mean, I'm convinced that it was done deliberately for that reason, not because of, you know, the argument was that our way of doing things is going to be less costly. It's turned out to not be that way anyway, and it's just full of problems and glitches all over the place. And ultimately, it will need to be dug up and repaired, and fiber optics to the house rather than to the end of the bloody street, and copper wires that have been underground for 100 years.
Right.
Yeah. So
I didn't know
goes
that.
somewhat towards somewhat towards what you're saying there, Pascal.
Yeah, and the idea was not like to encourage the dichotomy between you know, like white collar workers and blue collar workers, but you know, really the idea of how an economy is integrated. But that's a very interesting example that you're bringing up. I didn't know about that.
Deliberately degraded.
Yeah.
Deliberately degraded. I mean, it was sold as, you know, oh, don't worry, you'll have enough speed to be able to download your Netflix videos. As if the only thing that people in Australia were using the internet for was to watch crappy Netflix videos.
Mm-hmm. So you could see how the disconnect between like those that take the decisions and what, you know, the actual physical repercussion. Like that's
yeah,
amazing.
I mean, you know, it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate.
Unless, you know, that was their plan. Yeah.
The reality is that the internet, as originally suggested, the NBN from the Labor Party, would have provided access to really high-speed internet to just about everybody. Now, when you think about that in terms of the freedom to discover and the freedom to use that kind of process, that's scary for the people at the top.
Yeah.
It puts power in the hands of the people, potentially at least, that could lead to really, really new and interesting discoveries and new processes and new industries. And one of the consequences was that so many in, you know, certain heavy information industries like certain kinds of animation and video game animation and all that sort of stuff moved to New Zealand because the internet there was so much better. So we lost what was, and I'm thinking of a lot of media industries and things like that that deal with, you know, such, you know, huge data inputs from the internet. They literally moved out of the country. So, you know, Australia lost a potentially burgeoning and growing industry.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, overall, it's like, it's one of these dual edge technologies, right? Where I think from some quarters of those in the military industrial complex, out of which emerged the internet as we know it, they thought that this could be a domain to keep people to help control their victims. And then what we've also found is that, much like the Gutenberg press, you know, it could produce crappy books that make you dumber, or it could produce a platform, as we've seen, where a lot of people have access now to ideas and research that they would never. I mean, before the internet really became massively available to people, you had to sort of like get lucky getting a pamphlet physically on a street corner somewhere that would challenge some commonly held accepted narrative that you were accepted to believe by whatever corporate media was in place, or whatever 3 television channels, you know, that played the news, right, that you could drink from. The internet definitely broadened that availability of alternative media and alternative research that was more truthful. So that's great.
Yeah, think about what we're doing now. Think about what we're doing.
I mean, I was thinking about too, like there's a reason why Venice was also the domain that almost entirely monopolized the Gutenberg printing press.
Yeah.
It was Venice that had like 90% of the technology in their control, this tiny little zone, for several generations after it was discovered, because, you know, they wanted to act like, yeah, sure, we love knowledge. Now, I think that the controllers of Venice would have preferred that never even come into being. But when it became obvious that it wasn't going to be, you know, you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle like everything, they were like, well, let's at least try to co-opt and control and get control of the best, you know, of all of the major printing presses, and at the very least highly influence what books and what sets of ideas get published and read by the people who are now embracing literacy. So at the very least, we can at least control the damage a little bit that way and give people just the appearance of knowledge without the real thing, which is even worse than ignorance in some ways.
Yeah, and what did Venice do straight away? I mean, supposedly representatives of the Roman Catholic Church, etc., but they immediately began to publish all of Martin Luther's works.
There's a lot to this.
Yeah, I mean, they promulgated, you know, as a result of that, they promulgated many of the religious wars of that particular period of history. They did it quite deliberately.
Yeah.
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. Yeah. Yuppers.
Yeah.
That's true. We were actually reading on that subject recently. I read on that. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating to read all of that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You know, Venice and, you know, the history of Venice as an oligarch. Yeah. I mean, Webster Tarpley's stuff online that's available for free. He can be a little bit caustic. I mean, he obviously has an extremely low opinion of the Venetians, et cetera, but it's fun to read. And there are other authors writing on the same subject too.
Yeah, his language could be sometimes a little bit more diplomatic, but overall, some of that old research is invaluable.
Yeah. It's the research, it's the information that he provides that's interesting. As you say, sometimes his language is a little bit over the top. Yes.
All right, guys. So who wants to do a little recap next week?
I'm not good at recaps. I want to toss a little curve ball in there. You know, we were talking about anomalies before in relation to, you know, Pythagoras, et cetera, et cetera. And then we talked about Kepler.
Yes.
And one of his laws of, you know, planetary motion being elliptical.
Yes.
How do you explain the moon?
The moon?
Yeah, the moon. Our moon operates in an almost perfect circular orbit.
Oh, but it's still elliptical. It's like Venus. Venus is like got two foci that are super close together. So it looks like a circle, but they're really close foci. The moon is kind of like that too. It has like two foci that are very close together. It's not a perfect circle.
In Newton's words, the moon is the only thing that gave him a headache.
Well, see, but that's actually an interesting thing, right? Like in Newton's system, you immediately run in, unlike Kepler, there is no three-body paradox or three-body, what is it called? The three-body crisis?
Problem, yeah.
Three-body problem, yeah. So Newton's approach, which is totally bottom up, it's basically taking Kepler's formulas, extracting Kepler's harmonic Pythagorean method, and just keeping the outward shell, the dead shell of the formulaic number of the inverse square law, you know, that basically is derived from Kepler and one other little place. And in Newton's world, he's like, all you had to do is to discover gravity was not to bother yourself thinking about a whole system as a solar system or anything. Just let it first have a fruit fall on your head. And then from the fruit, you know, start thinking about the moon. And then from the moon, then start thinking maybe about another planet. But everything is like really based on this sensual bottom up, like I'm just going to take data from my senses and then describe and then find a formula that describes what my senses are telling me from the bottom up. There's no idea of a whole. So his formula, like they often worked pretty well when you were just dealing with like object A and object B based on their mass and distance and speed. So based on that alone, those variables, mass, distance, and speed, you were able to sort of like get a functional prediction with his math. But as soon as you added a third body, it all broke down. It was just the complexity of having that third element was just too much, and the system it failed, and it took a few generations for some fudging of the data from the Royal Society to come up with like a new replacement that I don't fully understand, which could finally begin to add more bodies into the system. But it just showed you that with Kepler, who made his discoveries and published them decades and decades before Newton did, there's no such problem as that at all whatsoever, you know, because it's based on a more simple harmonic idea, and it works nicely. Even if he didn't have the mathematics completely for it, he understood it, and it was a principled language that it provided the fertile soil for all of the great discoveries that came after, on a solid foundation. So yeah, guys.
Another fun discussion. I mean, we're talking economics, but it has been more about science than almost anything else, hasn't it?
Yeah, That was a surprise, eh?
I-
Well, you're
yeah,
going to get probably more of that next week too.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't what I was expecting.
Good. Yeah.
Very enjoyable though. Very enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. I like this.
Good.
All right, guys. So I guess I'll catch you all next Sunday. I don't know what we're gonna do this Sunday. I didn't really. We don't have a class prepared, so either I might just do something off the cuff on Sunday, or we'll just skip it, take a break, and then come back on for the reading next Wednesday. Okay.
Greetings to everyone.
Yeah.
Right,
good
Thank
night.
you again, everyone. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.